In many ways, it's a very interesting story, and in some ways, for a moment anyway, it's worth telling this story backwards, in the sense that one of the strongest criticisms that Podemos and some of the historians who work with Podemos in Spain have against not the right wing, not the members of the Partido Popular necessarily, or even the sort of extremely right-wing historians. Their argument is with the liberal historians who wrote and who were very important in the 70s after Franco died, and in the 80s, where they were writing a kind of liberal history in which one was meant to really kind of, how can I put it, sort of show that all sides were equal, in a sense, when all sides were clearly not equal. For example, there was a lot of talk about collective amnesia and the fact that people were much happier to not talk about these kinds of things. And it was a kind of public agreement. And so Podemos has really attacked those people and said, you know, it was a betrayal. And one of the things that we're very committed, that betrayal also made it possible for a kind of elite to reproduce itself after Franco that looked as though it was a liberal kind of elite, when in fact it was a perfect reproduction of Franco's kind of caste system. So that in a sense, one of Podemos' strongest criticisms against the sort of middle of the road kind of old socialists, for example, the PSOE, is precisely that they were sure they were right. They were trying to write a more sort of balanced history. But the truth of the matter is that they were really suggesting that people wanted to forget. And I must say that for me it was surprising to find them saying that people wanted to forget, in a way. Although it took me an awful long time to figure that out. When I first went to this rural area in Spain in the late 70s, it was very, very difficult to get people to talk about anything that happened in the Civil War. People would, I mean, there were sort of ways in which people would avoid saying anything about it. And then, you know, what you would find happening is that somebody would tell a story and then there would be a blank in the story, kind of thing. And then gradually you would get people to talk. One school teacher wanted to tell me about her. Well, I asked her about her father, and she said her father had been a mayor of the village during the Civil War, during the Republic. And this village that I was in was preeminently an anarchist village, part socialist and part anarchist. And she said, my father was an anarchist, but he was a very good father. And I wanted to make that the title of an article. I've never written an article with that title, but I think it's a wonderful, it says so much. She couldn't imagine her father being an anarchist and also being a good father. It just seemed inconceivable. And as she was sort of kind of working around trying to tell me the story without telling me the story, her mother came into the room and she was livid, absolutely furious. And she said to her daughter, "Why don't you tell him what happened? You know, why why are you trying to be so kind of polite with this foreigner? Why don't you tell him, that, and then she turned to me and she said, I've had 3 children married in this village. Me and my husband, before he was killed, ran the bakery, and I ran the bakery afterwards. So people had to come into my shop to buy bread. In the 3 marriages that I have had of my children in this village, I have never been allowed into the church. Nobody in the village talks to me. They come into the village, they buy the bread, but nobody actually speaks to me. I have been banished. And one of the interesting things about this, the sort of post-Civil War period and the Franco period is that there's a lot of geographical language used about. One of the things that, for example, is said is that people who were put in prison after the Civil War, and you could be put in prison after the Civil War for a law that was passed retroactively. So the law was passed in about 1942, that if you had been a supporter of the Republic in the 1930s, when the Republic was actually in existence, you could be imprisoned retroactively. And so, but one of the things that's often said is that when people were finally released from prison, they were not allowed to go back to their own communities. Now, I don't know anything about the statistics of that, but I can say that many times people would say, oh yes, well, Miguel was absent from the village after the war. And it would turn out that Miguel wasn't absent from the village at all. He was simply absent from public recognition. I mean, nobody looked at him, nobody talked to him, he was a non-person. And this is what this woman is really telling me. So as I say, I became interested in this issue of memory. And I think that the most in some ways, one of the most interesting stories about memory in this particular context is that it was extremely hot during the summer when I did my field work. I had 2 little girls who came and did the field work with me. So it would be sort of 45 degrees, very, very humid. And we would walk or take a bicycle or whatever for about 1 kilometer to a small sort of appendage village from where we lived, where there was a big watering hole. And the children would swim and families would gather and we would have a paella and drink wine, and it would be a sort of Sunday outing. And it was one of the most pleasant things that happened, during the busy times of field work. The name of the small village was Albania. And one time during the winter term, during the time when I was back here in Toronto, I found myself going through the library in this area of the, how the library is organized. So I found myself in this area. I was looking at sort of history of the Civil War area. And suddenly I found this great big fat wodge of a book that looked like a telephone directory. And it was called Las Matanzas de Franco, which is basically the killings of Franco. And it was a list of everybody who had been killed by the Franco regime, just after the war and during the war and so on. And so I, found myself thumbing through this book, and I kept finding this Albania name of places where these people had died. And I thought, well, must be another town, obviously a much bigger town, because quite a lot of people died. And then, of course, what I found out was that the very place where we all went to have our swim and paellas and drink wine was exactly where the concentration camp was that Franco used for killing off people after the Civil War. It was a place where people were machine gunned and so on. And many of the people who were swimming with me, their parents had died in this camp. It was never mentioned to me. It was never mentioned to me until I'd been doing field work for about 8 or 9 or 10 years, and then I was able to start talking to people. So I think that's a particularly interesting example of where memory is erased. I think that what's interesting is how it's now become such an issue for politics in Spain, and that's an area where I've been working on sort of silences and how these silences work in political work, political expression now. I guess what I should do now is talk a little bit about the non-ethnographic books that I've written, because I've written a couple of sort of monographs, one about Peru and one about Spain. But I've also written a couple of books that are perhaps less about ethnography. They use ethnography, but they're actually a series of kind of reflections. And the first of these is called Confronting the Present. So the first of these is called Confronting the Present, towards a politically engaged anthropology. And it's really a series of essays in which I try and, rather than thinking about the research itself as the starting point for writing about something, I try to take a particular problem, let's just say regional inequality in Europe, and then ask myself, how would an anthropologist study that particular kind of problem? How would you use ethnography to address that particular kind of issue? So what I'm trying to ask is how could anthropology be a more politically engaged subject, and how would that affect our research agenda? So I wrote a series of essays about that. That came out, I guess, just around 2000 or something like that. And then subsequently, quite recently, I mean last year, I think, I wrote another book called Intellectuals and Counterpolitics, which is called, with a subtitle of Essays in Historical Realism. And again, I'm still trying to push the same kind of question, I guess, but I think my emphasis has kind of has changed quite a lot. I think in the first book, I really wanted to try and be true to the kind of agenda that I think people like Sidney Mintz and Eric Wolf and June Nash had kind of set for us as anthropologists, and that is, how do you do fine-grained ethnographic fieldwork and also set it into the context of a much broader political economy, whether it's the political economy of Canada or Spain or the European Union? How do you move across those scales? And in the first book, I think that was what I was trying to do, really. I was trying to figure that out. So in a sense, the question that I was really asking myself was, what, as intellectuals, how can we understand the conditions of possibility for political expression of people who are disempowered? If we could find what the possibilities were for them to have effective action, then our job should be to sort of see what that sort of conditions of possibility were. So in some senses, it was very much like a sort of Europe and the people without history sort of framework. It was a kind of big framework in a sense. I think in the book that I've more recently written, I'm trying to kind of turn that around. I think that what's happened recently on the left, and social sciences on the left, whether we're talking about Bourdieu, or even for that matter Foucault, and the people who have followed on, is that we've become so preoccupied with trying to understand the big thing. By which what I mean by the big thing, I don't mean sort of physically big. I mean, how does governmentality work? You know, what does Foucault mean by governmentality? What is the nature of the political economy under finance capital? Those are the sorts of issues that somebody like David Harvey or Foucault, or somebody who writes in the Foucault tradition, those are the kinds of questions they're trying to ask. And I think they're very important questions. We need to know those things. But I think that what's happened is that we've forgotten that what we really are interested in is what Gramsci would call praxis. And praxis is trying to do research that tries to think about how collective groups of subaltern people can move history along in their direction. How do they actually do that? So in this more recent book, what I've tried to do is I've tried to take some ethnographic examples of ways in which people have pushed against the conditions that they find themselves in to try and move them in another direction, and try and see if we can find what the limits are to that and the possibilities are to that. And what does that mean for us as intellectuals to try and do something like that? So that's kind of, that sort of brings me up to the present, I think. I mean, I'm not sure how to do much more filling in the gaps.